We've just finished talking about what was going on the home front during World War I. As I mentioned early on, we fought our way through the war in about 5 or 10 minutes. The entry of the United States tipped the balance for the Allies, and within about a year and a half or so, it was all over. It was officially ended, however, with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, in June 1919. I've noticed in American history a lot of wars that involve European powers. They have their treaty negotiations at Paris because it's just the place to be. In this case, it was at the Palace of Versailles. One of the things decided during this treaty was that Germany was declared to be morally responsible for the war and therefore faced heavy reparations. They had to basically pay for the war. Now, was Germany solely, completely, morally responsible for the war? Not really. But they did lose, so that helps to make you responsible. What did this, how heavy was this burden of paying off these reparations? Well, they immediately started making the payments. They suspended payments for a while, what we like to call the Nazi era. Hitler wasn't real good about paying his bills. But then after World War II, they started paying them again. It was well into the 21st century. It was just a few years ago when this was finally paid off. And initially, in the early 1920s, it was a heavy burden on the German economy. So that's one thing that happened. Another thing that happened was the Ottoman Empire, today known as Turkey, was divided up by the victorious Allied powers into several different countries. In a lot of cases, this territory that included much of North Africa, the Middle East, all the way into parts of Southern Asia, this area was divided up into new countries, the boundaries of which were set according to what was going to make it most convenient for the colonial powers in charge of them. This meant they didn't give a lot of attention to what was actually within those boundaries where people were concerned. They wound up manufacturing new countries, in essence, that lumped together groups of people, tribes, ethnic groups, that didn't get along and in many cases had not gotten along in centuries. Now they're all lumped together under individual governments. How could that go wrong? Also, the European powers, the victorious European powers, opposed the independence of their colonies. That's something that Wilson had called for, and his European allies had never been real keen on. They didn't want to give up their colonies, so they were against that. Ultimately, one other big effect of the war was that several major powers were knocked out. Several major military powers: Germany, Austro-Hungary, Russia, really, because of the Russian Revolution, at least for a while, and the Ottoman Empire. By the way, there were some countries on the side of the Allies that you might not think of in terms of being Allied countries. That includes Italy and Japan. Japan came out pretty well as a result of pitching in on the Allied side in World War I, gave them an opportunity to gain control over some territory in the Pacific. Generally speaking, though, if you look at these 3 bullet points: Germany declared morally responsible and levied with reparations, number 1. Number 2, the Ottoman Empire partitioned up. Number 3, the opposition to colonies becoming independent. Those 3 things that were a part of this treaty laid the groundwork for a lot of friction. And by friction I mean massive amounts of people dying, for a long, long time. In a lot of ways, this situation that existed at the end of World War I was laying the groundwork for just World War II to be a continuation of it. It was just, they took a break for a few years. But it goes beyond that, if you think about it. The problems created by the partitioning up of the Middle East by the colonial powers, we're still dealing with that. We're still dealing with it. If you recall Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, the 14th one was a League of Nations that Wilson believed would be an outlet for countries to solve their problems in the future and would extend protection to weaker countries. A lot of Americans were opposed to this idea, including a lot in Congress. They didn't like the notion of America joining this club in which their policies really were going to be contingent on negotiating with these other countries. They called for some changes, Congress did, to the planned League of Nations before they would commit to joining. Woodrow Wilson refused to make any concessions to Congress. He refused to negotiate in any way because he believed that the treaty as it stood and the League of Nations as it was initially constructed was, quote, the hand of God, unquote. There again, his evangelistic streak coming into his politics. In October of that year, he suffered a major stroke. So the final months of his presidency, he wasn't doing very well at all. In fact, his wife was actually responsible for a lot of the things that went on. And clearly, he wasn't going to probably run for re-election. No one had ever run for a third term except for Teddy Roosevelt non-consecutively. During his I can't say convalescence because he didn't convalesce. He died eventually as a result of this stroke. The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles. The Senate refused to join the League of Nations. So, if I were to ask the question, what is the one major Allied country that did not join the League of Nations, it would be the country in which the idea was originated, the United States. Instead of participating in the League of Nations, isolationism set in. There had been a bit of an isolationist streak already for several years before the war, as you will recall, kind of a reaction against the Spanish-American War and the occupation of the Philippines. Well, now that's going to become the go-to attitude. Why get involved? Especially when this new world order constructed as a result of the war to end all wars didn't really seem to have ended all wars, didn't even seem to have slowed them down that much, and didn't seem to have really solved anything. So for a lot of people, there was a large degree of disenchantment and pessimism with involvement in other affairs outside the United States. So that's one consequence of the war. Another big consequence is the end of the progressive era. Wilson was the third progressive president. Again, progressive presidents were Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. The government, the Wilson administration, had really overstretched itself so much during the war and overreacted in checking people's individual freedoms and liberties that it had undone a lot of the trust that people had put in that movement. There was some very bad feeling about government in general by the time this was all over. And the pendulum swung back the other way after Woodrow Wilson. There's going to be in the 1920s a big victory for conservatives in Congress and in the presidency. And beyond even that, in American culture, the 1920s will wind up being one of the most conservative decades in American history. And again, coming right on the heels of the progressive era and that 1912 election where there were 4 different parties and all of them were left of center. That is now, by 1920, definitely a thing of the past.